So How Data Happened is a story of ideas and technology, a history of truth and power, one that concerns militaries, universities, and corporations, as well as states and people. There are moments of enthusiasm, just as there are moments of alarm. Divided into 3 parts and 13 chapters, the book follows and describes major intellectual transitions in the past, present, and possible future of data. You write, "We hope to show how we collectively got here, to illustrate the small coincidences, subjective design choices, and deceptions that ossified into what only seems like things that must be that way. By showing how apparently immutable results hinged on past choices, we can see how we can collectively choose a different future." So this is the promise and frankly the stakes of the book. And before we dive into the book itself and the history that you describe, I want to start by discussing your particular backgrounds and training, because Chris, you have developed machine learning methods for biology and health for over 2 decades at Columbia University, and you're also the chief data scientist at the New York Times. And Matthew, you are a historian of science, also at Columbia, who's tracked how mathematical ways of thinking and arguing were crucial to the study of nature and politics from the 17th century onwards. So the first question, again, before we dive into the book, is how do your disciplinary backgrounds merge with and complement each other? And how do these backgrounds ultimately bear on the book? And thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us. Wonderful to be here. Golly, well, I mean, I think Matt and I share actually a lot of the same values, although we have pretty complementary trainings. To be clear, Matt is, I have no trouble having technical conversations with Matt. So the conversations that we get into, and in fact, the way that we engage the students with computation are in fact led by Matt. So at this point, over the years of teaching that together. So although our trainings are complementary, I think we have a lot of the same interests and values. And we found in discussion that many of the topics we were delving into were taught neither to, let's say, history majors, nor to people coming from a technological background. We felt like there was a lot of material that would be interesting to people coming from both sides of the 2 cultures and would be new and interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that we came up with this book as a result of many years of teaching, and therefore drawing upon our complementary perspectives. And over time, those have really gelled into some of the way I think we're able to clarify things, clarify sort of key historical developments, but really make clear what are the hinge points, and also to suggest what is sort of the essence of some of the technological transformations or social transformations or a scientific transformation.
Yeah, so you both referred to this class that you've been co-teaching for, I think, about 5 or 6 years now. I'm curious, at what point did, in the kind of teaching of the class, did you think, let's write a book about this? Why, and at what moment did that happen, and why did you ultimately make that decision?
I think the class began initially as a relatively small seminar in which we were reading often sort of graduate level work, and beginning with a lot of really important history of science that had been done on statistics up through the period of the Second World War, and thinking about how we might apply that to much more recent sort of things. And as the class expanded, as many more students wanted to take it, and we had to do the sorts of things you do when you want to speak to a rather much larger undergraduate, we began having a very clear narrative of our, and that clear narrative of our own really began to come into focus. And it became, I think, ever more clear that there was really something that we had put together that might be worth having conversations about, turning into a book project. And then we began the process of working with a pretty amazing agent and then editor, and thinking through that, and in particular, and thinking through how do modes of address for a large non-scholarly audience, how to do that in a book format, and how does the undergraduate lecture form fit that and not fit that.
Okay, Chris, I'm going to go to you for the next question, because before we again go into this history, I just want everyone on the call to be aware of how you define data in the book, because you use a specific definition. It's, of course, a nice way also to frame our discussion. Can you tell us how you define this kind of enormous and amorphous word, and when might the last time that people on this call have kind of encountered or interacted with data as you define it?
Yes. So if you look at a dictionary, data is information organized for analysis. But in this book, we're really mostly talking about numbers. So we're talking about data as a set of facts, and mostly we're talking about numbers and the analysis of numbers, which includes mathematical analysis. My love with the word data is influenced by my own upbringing as a Columbia College undergraduate, which encourages us to look at the etymology of things and the root causes of things. I like the fact that the word data comes from a word that means to give, or that something is given to you, because I think it's a apt choice of the word we use for facts presented, or truth presented as numbers, really, because it when somebody gives it to you, it sort of doesn't invite critique. It doesn't invite sort of you to investigate, well, where did you get it from, and what was the provenance, and how did you make this thing, or did somebody else make it, and what was their design choice? So I like looking at the etymology of the word, and how people, when they are given data, often don't feel comfortable to critique it and question it. Instead, they're just like, well, this was what was given to me, but I was given these data, so I'm going to have to work with that. So that's the particular aspect of the word that I like working with, is the etymology of it. And in the book, we're mostly talking about how people try to decide what is true using numbers, and the additional power that conveys when one is armed with a quantitative data set, and how companies and states used data and numbers to try to advance their own interests, including getting to say what is true.
Yeah, and about that about how we use data in the book, it's important for where we begin the book, because for us, data is shorthand both for the accumulation of numbers about something, and numbers that often take on this kind of truthiness, as Chris is saying, but also, as Chris underscored, the new form of analysis of that. So we pick up in really the early 19th century, precisely because it's a moment in which there's an explosion of numerical data that is thought to be particularly relevant for learning about human beings, about states, about agriculture, about all kinds of things. But it's not just that explosion. It's also an explosion of an interest in new analytical tools for handling that data. And so we follow the path both of the accumulation of ever more numerical information, and the development of ever more robust analytical tools for dealing with these increasingly large pools of data that are available to companies, governments, and in some cases, individual people.
Great. So let's go to the 19th century, because you pose this question. I think this is really at the heart of this beginning discussion. You write, how did we come to think that numbers are essential to understanding the world and the lives of people? In other words, how do we move from a society of, again, you write lush descriptions of the countryside to one of counting flora and fauna, the gruesome reality of death to tables of mortality statistics, from the judgment of character of a student to the use of standardized tests. Can you tell us about this specific moment and the 19th century Belgian astronomer Adolf Ketteler, who, you write, dramatically altered how we think about societies?
Matt, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I mean, one of my favorite quotes in the book is this 1806 quotation from a German very upset that the so-called vulgar statisticians are mistaking the accumulation of number as if that's actual knowledge about anything, but particularly knowledge of the state and other things. And it's a very helpful moment of that historical contingency that you alluded to in your really wonderful introduction. because it indicates how non-obvious that was, and what how much work needed to be put into place to make it appear that one of the primary ways we should go about knowing the world, knowing people, and making decisions about the world and making people should come through numbers. And there's no question that the early 19th century was a moment of explosion and contestation around exactly that. And Quetelet was a Belgian astronomer, and he was incredibly taken with new methods that had been developed by great mathematicians and astronomers in France and in Germany for handling observations of the astronomical world and integrating them into the Newtonian picture of the universe. And while he was waiting for an observatory to be built such that he could continue this astronomical effort, he was suffering from many of the after effects of the French, the sort of long French Revolution, only moment, and revolutionary disruption. And he came to try to apply a whole series of these techniques and assumptions to data about human beings. And the end result was that he used tools that had come from astronomy for thinking through observation to begin characterizing groups of humans and human behavior, and to argue that there was a stratum of the social world that could be observed using these new tools that would become to be called statistical tools, and that would help us understand that something like suicide rates or the crime rate, that those had a kind of a mathematical identity that could be seen, and that were something above and beyond individual choice that could be used to characterize a group of people, a city or a nation, or frequently in the idiom of the day, would be used to characterize the race, the Belgian race, the French race, the German race, and other things. And so Quetelet is the figure we begin with because he so clearly unites this new drive towards the collection of data, and he spends much of his life working on that, with the development of new analytical techniques that enabled him and others to see things in that data that were thought to be really significant for human beings.
Chris, would you like to add anything?
I think you're right, Alice, to pick up on contests. You know, we tried to write a book about fights. So one of the reasons we chose that particular period to start talking about the history of data was not that it was the first time people had ever counted anything, but it was a particular time where people fought over whether or not data should have a seat at the table in defining what is true. So those transformations around, for example, whether or not statecraft, the craft of understanding and ruling a state, should be about narrative understanding of the greatness of the men who run the country, rather than amassing mere tables and how we should use tables, is one of the prototypical fights from that particular time that is really useful to look back on, because fights about whether or not data is the key to understanding what is true continue to this present day, all day, every day. You know, my role at Columbia and my role at the New York Times are both afford me the opportunity to have, you know, conversations about whether or not the data are really defining what's true or something else is defining what's true multiple times a day. So it happens in the 19th century around statecraft, around, for example, settling of insurance policies. The example you gave of, or the example you quoted of the gruesome details of death, rather than merely amassing death tables, that turns out to be a perfectly fine way to make money when you amass what is now the basis of insurance. And yet it was a very different way of understanding something where it was, I think, clear to many people for a long time until it wasn't, that data was not the right way to solve the problem. And that story keeps happening again, chapter and chapter, as each one of these chapters is a story of some transformation in which people flipped an understanding of how to decide what's true, and how to obtain and wield and defend power armed with data.
Great. So this moves on to the next question, because this is precisely this idea, you know, this is a through line throughout the book, this theme that radical technical disruptions often paradoxically serve to reinforce existing inequalities. Can you talk about this theme in the context of race? So Matthew, you alluded to this, but can you tell us about how it was specifically used at the turn of the 20th century to categorize, control, and reinforce racial categories?
Yeah, so it's part of a much bigger story about the 19th century, in which you have, of course, all kinds of older forms of, as it were, cognitive bias and prejudice, and the constitution of various kinds of, massive systemic, excuse me, systemic inequalities that are entrenched in all kinds of ways. But you have with many of the early figures that are central to statistics, you have a desire to characterize social difference and understand it, and in this case, through numbers. And because the numbers are taking an increasing authority, um, the, the characterizations of human difference that are emerging are thought to be not the products of some sort of backward old prejudices, but rather grounded in the very best science of the day, the best observational examination of people's heads and their brains and their body parts, their ability to respond to various kinds of stimuli. So it was a moment that involved people from a variety of positions in the political spectrum, in which a kind of progressive science was thought to be illustrating what was genuinely the case about human beings, as opposed to, say, older forms of discrimination. And it takes many different forms. And one of the moments we talk about in the book is a cousin of Charles Darwin named Francis Galton, who gives us both the statistical technique that's called regression, and also the name eugenics, for deliberate policy of breeding people so as to develop the kind of superior race that is needed by nations. But as I said, one of the things that's enormously important about this at the turn of the 19th century is that this was so much I'm sorry, this is a mosquito. This was so much something that bridged many political positions in a way that is quite odd to us, particularly from a position of well after the Second World War.
Chris, would you like to add anything?
Well, power is a through line through the book, and discussions of race in the book are intimately connected with discussions of power. Who has power, and how do they use emerging technologies to defend their own powers, or to use data to argue that the status quo is the way it must be. So those are some of the through lines through the book. And race is an extremely illustrative point, particularly in US history, but actually in plenty of other countries. We touch on, for example, really the importation of race statistics into the context of India from England, for example, in one of the chapters, as well as in many chapters, the American context in which race really permeates the history of the United States. And it starts at the birth with eugenics. So as Matt mentioned, the person who gave us the word correlation and the word regression is also the person who gave us the word eugenics. So it's sort of dishonest not to tell the story of eugenics as part of the story of statistics, certainly as a field. And it's also very relevant to the present days of the conversations about how data-enabled algorithms and automated decision systems reinforce powers are very active conversations in the States right now. And it's simply part of the through line throughout the book.
Yeah, you say this is kind of from that moment, you write, no matter how powerful the algorithm or extensive the data, if one fails to embed this data analysis within broader forms of knowledge, scientific and humanistic alike, that so-called knowledge should be seen as incomplete at least, dangerous at worst. And that's a kind of another through line, the disconnect between the data and the kind of structure of knowledge that surrounds the data and the way that the data is being wielded. At the risk of really just we really have to skip along here. I thought we'd go to the mid-20th century, to the Second World War. We were talking about England, to Bletchley Park. This is really crucial because this is a moment and a location in which data analysis becomes industrial. There was a scaling up, an escalation, in which systems were created that allowed previous methods to be applied to thousands of items of data at great speed. Can you talk about this revolution in the history of data that happens at this moment?
Sure. So we broke the class and the book into 3 parts with 3 transitions. One transition is around trying to import the scientific method and that particular mindset into the way we make sense of data. The second part of the book opens with Bletchley Park for several reasons, including the creation of computation. And computation, as we show, is born of data. It's born of what we would now recognize as a data science problem, trying to deal with streams of messy real-world data, make sense of it, on a budget and in a hurry. And the way that that problem was solved was to create digital computation. So that story of digital computation is intimately tied to the story of data, and it's an incredible transition point at which data becomes industrial. So it becomes not so much a concern of gentlemen scholars like Galton or even the academy and trying to set what is true. Instead, it becomes an engine of power. Bletchley Park is really the birth of that. And as it scales up, we also get the birth of what we would later call the military industrial complex as corporations get into the data game, initially funded by military concerns, particularly around cryptanalysis. And once they have this incredible armamentarium of digital computation, then it becomes necessary to sell it to corporations, and making sense of data, making sense of process through data becomes integral to corporations. We talk mostly about the American context, but it is a global phenomenon that corporations make sense of the world through data.
Matthew?
I would just underscore 2 facets of this. As you said, it was an industrial process. So these early digital computers were about accumulation and investigation of data, and not just the computation of a small set of numbers. So on the one hand, it is about building infrastructures that are able to deal with what were at the time quite large data coming in relatively good time. You have the infrastructure, and the other facet is a kind of a vision of how it is that you're going to analyze this and what it's producing. And it's a vision that is highly instrumental. And that highly instrumental approach towards what it is you get out of data, that it is something that is actionable, is in tension with much of what happens in the 20th century, where there's a concern about what are sort of scientific definitions of truth. And so those run in parallel through the 20th century in tension and in much controversy. Much of the explosion of data in the data sciences in more recent time comes again from some fundamental continuities in the expansion of infrastructure, and also a continuity of a kind of instrumental approach to using data for predictive and other kinds of purposes, rather than from, say, a purely natural scientific approach dedicated in a kind of search for truth. And that itself leads to controversy at various times.
Yeah, I mean, I also wanted to go to Bletchley Park because, again, it highlights the theme that we mentioned previously, this radical technical disruption, reinforcing existing inequalities, because I thought this was fascinating that while most of the cryptographers working on this machine were men, all of the operators were women. So even in the division of labor of these technical revolutions, the division of labor is very normative. And
yeah. I hope that point comes across in the book, that as soon as data becomes about labor gets gendered. Like immediately from the get-go, it's decided, well, this aspect of data is clearly the men's job. This aspect of data is clearly the women's job. That, from if you work in the software engineering industry today, you'll certainly see that is true to present day. There are certain tasks that are primarily occupied by male programmers and others with a higher ratio of female programmers. It was there from the birth of computation.
Yeah, and that story of labor, it's one we intertwine in it's often gendered, and it's also as it enters on more contemporary times, it tends also to be done by people who are little exposed in the sort of glossy press releases or accounts of of the development of great new algorithms. So in many cases, it's extremely hard for us to know as users or scholars who it is that are doing much of what various people have called sort of data janitorial, data curation. So for example, with the algorithms and models that have ChatGPT and other sorts of things, it's actually very little known who it is that's doing this work, but what we do know suggests that it takes on exactly this kind of labor dimension where it's in many cases gendered and in many cases um, it outsourced far away from the heart of where these corporations are sitting and doing most of what is the viewable labor. So in talking about Turing, we wanted, of course, to mention Turing, but again, to emphasize that Bletchley Park was this large industrial operation involving large new computers and a lot of people, including an army of women, who were doing this. And in doing this work, we're depending on sort of a generation of scholars who've really done the careful work to interview the women, many of them right before they died, in order to understand the story. And then it just continues to this day, where questions of access are not about official secret acts in the UK, but rather corporate secrecy about who is doing the kind of work that makes these things sustainable.
Okay, super. So what to continue, well, I guess to think about unveiling secrets and looking at the dark underbelly of this explosion. So looking also to the post-World War II moment, second half of the 20th century, as data collection on citizens and consumers totally explodes and continues to explode, some critics begin to emerge, posing questions about the legal and political ramifications of the effect of this explosion on privacy, justice, security. You cite Harvard law professor Arthur Miller, who writes in 1971, "We must begin to realize what it means to live in a society that treats information as an economically desirable commodity and as a source of power." You point out, though, that other questions were set aside in the 1980s and 90s. So the question, I suppose, is in the second half of the 20th century, what conversations are happening and what conversations are not happening, and why? And what are the effects of this today?
So, part of one of the many uses of history is to look for historical antecedents of present contests. And at present, we seem to be having a lot of conversations about what should be the limits of power and what are the risks of consolidating power in the hands of a few when it comes to data. So we take pains to illustrate how much of this has precedent, particularly around concerns about too much power in the hands of the state. So we spend a bit of time as we look at the rise of accumulation of data, looking at how people dealt with the concern that there would be disproportionate power in the hands of the few who hold lots of data about society, except at the time it was in the form of fear of the state. So a lot of the regulations and acts and laws that we rely on in the United States for keeping a check on data power are really pointed at the state, specifically at the federal government in the United States. So we're at a time right now in which we're having a lot of debate. However, because the debate is about power not in the hands of the state, but in terms of corporations, the language and the narrative around it is much more around ethics. And so we try to take a scalpel to the word ethics and how people define ethics and how people design for ethics, because the systems of checks and balances are not the ones that have been hammered out under the construct of democracy, where checks and balances between the people and the state. It's really some much more Wild West, so to speak, that is unstabilized game among people and the state and private corporations.
Yeah, and so one of the key moments we talked about is that in around the time of Watergate in the United States, a moment of sort of deep distrust of the state, but also of considerable distrust with corporations. There's a vibrant conversation about privacy. And that and bills are introduced in the U.S. Congress, bipartisan bills that are quite extensive and look very modern in certain ways. And the way that legislation plays out is that the corporations are able to convince enough people in Congress that there aren't real known existing harms from commercial use of data, whereas there's deep concern about federal government use. And so privacy becomes narrow in U.S. law, and which then has ramifications worldwide, to being concerned about largely about government and a much more of a Wild West rules in the corporate sphere. This comes to seem natural by the late 90s, and data is seen as a necessary asset that corporations are necessarily able to accumulate about their users. But none of that is natural at all. And so it's one of those moments we really want to bring out. The other is that privacy comes to be seen in this largely individualistic way, that the defense of the individual against privacy encroachment is something that's up to them to solve. And one of the key instances of this is that early on in the development of the web browser, there were some concerns about the privacy about information of people browsing the web. And the decision is made, well, people can choose to opt out of this, but the default was going to be that they're going to opt into allowing data sort of collection. So you have this combination of a kind of permissiveness, an individualism about solutions to this, and then options which are defaulting initially around the 2000s to not be private. And I think all of that has gelled very much and often has been now seems natural, but none of it is at all natural. And our solutions to our quandaries involve both understanding that and then thinking about what are different ways of organizing our concerns about privacy, our defaults about privacy, our conversations.
I mean, that's a really interesting example, because it leads me to the question that I had also about this time period, which is that in that particular case, there was a clearly decision made by a group of people or one person to do this, but elsewhere you write that the velocity of the expansion of the use of data far outpaced broad recognition of its potential harms during this time period. To what extent was there just a sense of so much was happening so quickly at such an enormous scale that people simply couldn't keep up? And in the sense, they're not responsible because no one could be responsible for, to react to this emergence.
I mean, looking at the literature then, I don't get the sense that people feel the way they do today, that they sort of are being outrun by AI. There's a sort of a frantic nature to the conversation around data today. I think at the time it was more a sense about tension versus, for example, innovation or competitiveness or what needs to be done. And I think it was more a sense that privacy was somehow either antithetical to capitalistic innovation or something like that, rather than the feel like the technology was moving so fast. I do think people did seem at the time to be quite overwhelmed by the scale of data. There's actually one of the figures in the book is a great infographic of this sort of cartoon of all these different databases wired together in a way that's going to impinge on our personal liberty. So I think some people, we quote the lawyer Miller as one example. I think people were aware of what could happen when that much data was put together, but it lacks the aspect of velocity, to use that word that you drew out from today's conversation, in which a lot of the narrative is about, could we just, as some people have put it, slow down? Like AI seems to be happening so fast right now. People are literally writing suggestions that we just need to just slow down. Things are just moving too fast for us to feel like we know what's going on. In general, I do think there's a constant transition among the forces that work on individuals. The legal scholar Lessig talks about people being constrained by norms, laws, markets, and architecture. And all of those things, I think, have their own time scale. So architecture in the sense of technology, I should say. So architecture here meaning technology moves very fast. Our norms slowly catch up. Markets catch up, although often faster than our norms. For example, the job postings for prompt engineers, which have popped up in the last month, just as people start using ChatGPT. And so now there's a market to be hired as a prompt engineer. And the slowest of those four is laws. So our regulations and our laws, they move at a very, very slow time scale compared to technology and economic opportunities and our own sense of norms. So I think it's natural that it took a lot of debate, 1960s through 1970s, for people to come together to pass regulations on privacy as well as ethics. What should be considered ethical use of human subjects research funded by the federal government in the States.
Yeah, and I'll just make one brief remark here is that it's both the case that, well, people will often say, look, technology is outstripping the law. And the last thing we want to do is hamper the technology with outdated law. And there's no question that it's quite true. Technology often hampers the law. But what we see again and again is the claim that the technology is adequate for understanding what the law is supposed to be, just to remove the agency around the process of reconstructing the law in order to be appropriate to a technology. And a place where this is very clear is in the wake of the 9/11 attack in the United States. An act comes into force of law, the Patriot Act, very quickly within weeks of 9/11. And when it's defended, it starts, well, it's merely updating the law to be appropriate technology. And there's no merely updating. Because that moment was a moment that was seized by a lot of people in the federal bureaucracy for updating the law in a very particular way, and a way that that enabled the federal government to use data at incredible scale while claiming to follow a much more traditional securing of privacy and searching and rights against search and seizure. So that play where people say, well, yeah, the law needs to be updated to match the technology, often involves a history that is not true, a history that technology implies how the law seems to be. And one of the important things to do is to put a stop to that and recognize the relative autonomy of the law, even as the technology is moving ahead very quickly.
There's really so much to say, but I'm looking at the time and I want to give our audience time also to pose questions. So please go ahead and post your questions in the chat. If you joined us late, we have 10 minutes or so so I can integrate your questions into the conversation. So please post your concerns, comments, thoughts, etc. And again, I suppose in the interest of time, and I had more questions, but I want to go to your final chapter, the lucky 13th chapter, Solutions Beyond Solutionism. You ask, what are the present contests among power whose resolution will help determine the future of data? You describe this unstable three-player game comprised of corporate power, state power, and people power. Can you tell us about these three powers and your various predictions or prophecies?
Yes. So we open that chapter. So the structure of the book is that the penultimate chapter is about problems and the final chapter is about solutions. And we open that chapter saying, it's very difficult to predict the future. It's much easier to shine a light on what are the present contests such that the resolution of those contests is going to shape the future. So to try to be slightly analytic about power, we say, well, let's attempt to divide power into state power, people power, and corporate power. And that lens allows us to go through some of the present contests and see what is the interests and what are the roles of the different players in those particular contests. So, for example, we talk about current regulations which are being contested in the United States or in the EU, and a bit about what the interests are of the people there. We talk a bit about the roles of companies to try to provide tech fixes to some of the problems that consumers and members of the electorate are concerned about, and whether or not those companies are responding preemptively to potential fears of regulation, the extent to which those companies are themselves having competitive advantage over other companies by advancing consumer protection. And we spend some time on private ordering, which is a more legally scholarly term for people power, the idea that private individuals do enact some direct regulation on companies and on society, whether or not those people are employees or our customers, but particularly for the employees, we try to look at the ways that employees have been impacting tech companies, particularly over the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and we very much do not take the approach that we have a panacea or that there's a clear resolution of these sorts of things. What we're interested in mapping out earlier in the book is precisely these moments of contact moments that ought to call into question where people give you too easy narratives about the way things have to be. And in the end of the book, we want to equip people with ideas of the various kinds of solidarities that might be necessary in thinking through these kinds of problems, that much of the progress in defending various facets of the use of the internet or people's rights or other sorts of things have often involved sort of strange combinations of, say, internet companies and civil libertarians, in which there isn't necessarily a deep philosophical agreement that is shared, but nonetheless is very politically potent and economically potent. And that we are collectively, and we need to think through that, to think about diversity within corporations rather than treating sort of uniform entities, entities in which their employees are important agents, as well as the company, and also the limit of that sort of thinking. At some level, we were here motivated by our students who wanted answers, and we very much didn't have the hubris to think that we had the answers, but we very much wanted to give them the kinds of tools, because they're the kind of people who are going to be in tech positions and policy making positions, legal positions, in thinking through all of these kinds of things. And so our a collection of different sources of power are really there to help people think through the diverse ways in which they can work to produce an organization of these technological systems that comport more with different collective senses of the kind of social and economic order we want to live in.
I mean, yeah, you mentioned, or whether working in a tech corporation or working as a policymaker or as a lawyer, there is this sense both in the corporate discussion and in the people discussion that there's an inside and an outside, so that you talk about internal versus external corporate ethics making, you talk about people power within organizations, external to organizations. Can you talk about this kind of insider outsider point of view and how it relates to power?
Well, particularly when it comes to corporations, there's an easy divide there, in that the impact of, let's say, product managers and data scientists within a company that's developing data-enabled algorithms is different than the impact of people on the outside who can merely protest, or they can, agitate to their local elected officials, or they can boycott those companies in various ways, either by not giving them their money or not giving them their data. Right? When people drop off of Twitter, for example, they're denying Twitter the user base more so than denying Twitter the actual money, since very few people who are using Twitter are also paying for Twitter, but it's still a type of data boycott. So that's one way we try to be analytic about who has the power in the insider-outsider dynamic of companies. With inside companies, there's been a lot of attention, certainly paid by members of the press and also normal consumers, to the way that private individuals can have power on a company by being, for example, whistleblowers, or after they've left a company, many tech insiders have gone on to publicize or call attention to risks posed by technologies being developed by those companies. So people who work within companies have an outsized impact, particularly people who work in centers of power, like around data or product, to shape or impact the future of those companies.
Would you like to add anything?
No, other than I think it is enormously important, and I think to recognize that in some sense, the heterogeneity of the firm, as the economists would say, that we tend to sort of reify companies as sort of one thing, and there's reasons for that, given the reach, particularly of the corporations that we're talking about at the end of the book. But it's in many ways to ignore their dependence, on the one hand, on huge troves of different kinds of labor, and on the other hand, of large user bases. And it can seem like both those employees and these user bases are powerless, but they need not be.
Thank you both very much. I have more questions if the chat does not Phil. We have two pretty large questions though. I imagine one response to this book is people are simply just asking you, what should we do about this specific problem? So this is one of those kind of questions. Steve Abramson writes, how do you deal with bad actors who use false data to influence voters? I suppose the larger question too is, can you talk about the relationship, that I dread saying this, the relationship between data and democracy?
It is a good and big question. I suppose two of the ways we address it, well, again, as I was saying earlier, one is to caution people about the limits of tech fixes. So in the chapter on ethics and the chapter on solutions, we talk about one narrative about people arguing that the answer to bad tech is more tech, and we try to look at the limits of that. As an example, the question is about false data. False data makes sense when it's 1 + 1 = 2, 1 + 1 = 3. It's a little unclear for a lot of the information that is most contested, because some of that information, it's statements of opinion, or it's memes that are sort of not even wrong, or it can be things where when it's labeled by human labelers, the human labelers won't even come to consensus as to what's real and what's not real. So the particular type of information that often people are most concerned about it's not exactly black or white, false or not. And so instead, in the book, we talk about the limits of tech fixes, and then we try to draw attention to the diversity of powers that are relevant. Again, people power, state power, corporate power. One of the utilities of having a 3-player unstable game is to emphasize that the future is not yet set. It's still unstable. And the other, as Matt mentioned, is that when you look at power in terms of 3 players, then there can be one that's dominant, but that means that the other 2 are always ready to collude and form various relationships that destabilize whoever is the incumbent.
So we have another question from Patty, the kind of elephant in the room always of late, about ChatGPT. How should they teach using the tools such as ChatGPT? So I suppose maybe we can talk about it kind of theoretically, and then maybe also, how are you thinking about it in your classes at Columbia?
It's definitely not theoretical in our class, actually. So as I was saying, we've taught this class 7 times, and over the years, we've sort of settled on a dynamic in which Matt is leading the computational labs. I know Matt has already used ChatGPT several times in the labs, so we are definitely teaching ChatGPT and encouraging students to use it. That said, part of the way we're teaching students is to understand the history of things. So there's a history to chatbots. There's a history to large and completely uninterpretable artificial neuronal nets as sort of black box predictors, or also generators. So we try to teach them that history and how it fits into context. And again, we try to emphasize that new technologies spark a destabilization of economic markets and our norms, and eventually laws and regulations, which move on a longer timescale. Matt, as the person who's writing and teaching our GPT labs, your thoughts on that?
There's a lot that one could say here, and some of it very practical kind of advice, and some of it more theoretical. One of the things that we teach the students is that it's not at all accidental that something from ChatGPT appears to be human-like, that there's a real deliberate use of a form of algorithm that uses humans ranking the answers of ChatGPT such that the model learns to produce things that appear ever more persuasive. Now, when I say appear, they're not persuasive. So that understanding that this is a tool that is designed to appear spontaneous, both by virtue of the way it, pretends that it's typing, that it isn't sort of just spewing this forth as fast as possible, but also in the very rhetorical forms which emphasize a kind of a kind of knowingness that isn't really there. In terms of how to use them, I mean, I think it's easy to sort of think there are analogies like the use of a digital calculator, which caused a certain furore at one point in the last 50 years, and then a change in practical pedagogy. And I think there's something to that. Like, how is it that you're going to give assignments that students can't easily subvert. But I think to think about this technology as the sort of something you drop into a class, as opposed to part of a much larger infrastructure in which we think about how we're going to use it, is that it is going to be very important for integrating it more thoroughly into how we teach students to think about it, how to think about what it means for disinformation, which is going to be an enormous problem, and then how they might proactively use it. And I think there's going to be a lot of very creative pedagogical work, which, just like with a digital calculator, comes a point where you're going to do something very different than you might, and students are going to have to do different kinds of work. I think there's a lot of collective effort right now to do exactly that.
Yeah, if I may add, Matt using the word rhetoric reminds me that we leverage a lot earlier work by scholars in the humanities wondering how do we deal with computation. So a lot of the present day conversations about how do we deal with data as part of our pedagogy have echoes in conversations 2 decades ago around people in the humanities for how do we incorporate computation into our understanding. And at the time, there was some good writing about what do we really want students to be able to do? And it's not just the functional aspect of writing computer codes, but it's also being able to understand how the result of a computation is part of a story, part of a narrative, or an advancement of some position, and also how to be critical when somebody comes at you with some piece of rhetoric which is computationally enabled one way or the other. I ran some computer simulation and it said this, therefore something is true. That sort of critical sense definitely permeates our class. And in our labs, I think we're trying to teach some balance of those three: some functional capabilities, some rhetorical capabilities, and some critical capabilities. ChatGPT and large language models being an example of generative AI, meaning they actually generate text, is a good example where we want students to be able to use the tool. We want people to understand functionally how to do it. And in fact, we have some labs where they're effectively using small versions of a small language model rather than a large language model, but also critically, when you're presented with something that was generated by one of these technologies, to understand, how was it designed? What were the interests of the people who productized it? And to what extent should it be believed or critiqued?
You're both discussing this so coolly, and you seem to have integrated it so seamlessly. When this stormed onto the stage in the autumn, did it at all surprise you, or did you feel that you knew this was coming and you were ready to, as I say, integrate it?
So our students should have known it was coming because they literally used it. Certainly last spring that we used GPT as part of our labs. So the product ChatGPT, which was launched in November, was the productized version of GPT-3, which had been available to researchers and others as an API. GPT-2 was available to some researchers in 2010 or 2019 rather. So it wasn't entirely new. What really hit for people was when it was made as a nice product in the form of a chat, and the product design was very well done, and it just really captured like wildfire everybody's awareness of it. So it's really focused a lot of conversations, and it's really sparked a lot of new creativities.
Thank you. We have a question from Nathan, who asks, does it make sense for you to think of the use of data in terms of metabolism? And if so, what are the boundaries of the organism using the data, corporations, nations, the planet, etc.?
Certainly there are communities that choose to use or not to use data, or choose to accept the data way of knowing as a valid way of knowing, and other communities that do not choose to accept that data is a valid way of knowing things. So perhaps the organism is a set of communities, that can be what's so painful about culture transformation within a corporation. You might have a company that's been doing, I don't know, wine recommendations for a long time, and then suddenly they have an abundance of data, and then they have to decide, well, do we use these data about people's ratings or sales, or do we use the knowledge of expertise? And that story keeps happening over and over again. Baseball scouts is a good example from 20 years ago. Actually, a friend of mine from graduate school got a job doing what is now called Moneyball, meaning using statistical methods to evaluate different baseball players. It's a great example where there was a centuries of ways of understanding something, and then suddenly people started collecting little tables, and then there was a fight about whether or not those tables should have a seat at the table. So I would say the metabolism is on the order of a community. It happens in the fight over statistics and table makers in 1806. It happens in baseball statistics. It certainly happened in computational biology when I was a graduate student, that making sense of life and one way of knowing under molecular biology was sort of disrupted by functional genomics 20 years ago. So again, I actually think there's a lot of fruitful material to be taught if you teach the history of data as a history of exactly these sorts of contests, as not just about 1 + 1 is 2, but these fights about whether or not data is a valid way of understanding of problems from a particular domain.
And I would add just one thing. If you listen to Chris's examples, it's not that you have a whole bunch of, say, humanistic examples that are being capsized by some sort of science. It's not science versus the humanities at all, because the potential of this way of working applies both to things like marketing in a drugstore, transformations in biology, the teaching of English, and other stuff. And then in the case of like ChatGPT, one of the biggest threats isn't to essay writing, which a lot of academic attention has been, but actually to coding itself, which is right now a highly paid and highly esteemed activity. That these are all at various times under threat by these new ways of knowing and doing. And we can look at them symmetrically, as rather than treating it as a science versus humanities story, which just doesn't get at the phenomena that we're looking at.
So maybe we can apply what you've just said to this next question. This will be, unfortunately, the final question, essentially making a distinction between knowledge and information.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. And,
A big question, and we have 2 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, so very quickly, there were a number of people in, say, the like 1990s, and said, what we're really interested in is wisdom and knowledge, but we really believe that data is the way to get there. And one of the stories we want to tell in our narrative is how is it that data comes to be very prominent in thinking about our own definitions of knowledge. And one of those moments is the moment of the development of classical statistics and the redefinition of science in terms of significant testing, and then pressure against that and other sorts of realms. I think there's both a kind of narrow scientific discussion and then a much more broad social discussion about the extent to which the kind of things that data enables us to know, and data analysis enables us to know and to do, how is it that those contribute to what we might actually call knowledge, or even, as some people would want to go, into wisdom. That's a non-trivial point. And it's a non-trivial point within the community, though it's often, I think, can be smashed together in ways that are historically inappropriate and definitely politically inappropriate.
Chris, would you like to add a final point?
Maybe two. One, that historically people often frame themselves as having a value add, and that they are capable of transforming from information to knowledge. So part of the rhetoric of the words knowledge and information is the idea that I'm going to turn your information into knowledge. And the another also rhetorical point is how one of them sort of conveys or putting them together somehow implies that one is objective and one is subjective, that the information will be the objective part, that everybody knows this information, but the knowledge that I will provide is somehow this subjective thing that I will bring to you. So I guess those are the only two sort of rhetorical points that come to mind when I think about that juxtaposition of knowledge versus information.